Okay. I think they're interesting questions, and I think, and they're provocative questions because I think they embedded in them are like a series of assumptions, right? And so, like the question of King, of like, how do we still see King's impact today, right? Like, and so I was saying the other day, I went to so I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, and so I went to the Ali Center, and the family that helps to curate and maintain and fund that, I was talking to the son, and he was saying to me, he's like, I love what we're doing here. Um, he said, because Muhammad Ali clearly still has an impact in this world, right? Particularly within the Black community, um, given what he did and has continued to do. He said, but it's funny because we think about like how the impact that he's currently having is very different than the impact that he initially had, right? Which then made me think about your question and just kind of the whole conversation around King and what impact is he having. And I'm like, okay, well, that has a lot to do with how we remember him, right? Like there's like obvious impacts, like, okay, well, he helped to get, um, the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65. He helped to get the bill passed. He helped to do that, right? And he didn't do that by himself, but he was part of that. He's attributed to that, right? But it's like he doesn't get that bill passed without the race riots, right? The Watts riots, rather, right? And JFK looking at the Watts riots and go, okay, either we do this King's way or we have to deal like Malcolm's way, right? And he was actually quoted as saying this. He's like, so King becomes successful at getting bills and policies passed, not because he's necessarily docile and preaching love and Nagarjuna is like and Gandhi's notions of like peace, but he's primarily effective. His approach is effective because there's someone else who represents the threat of violence. And so now, we as a country are forced to choose. Do we want to deal with the person who's asking us to do this peacefully, or do we want to reckon with the one who's willing to engage in the same violence that relegated them to that space in the first place, right? To use the same violence against people who've used violence against them. And so I think that's it. So you think about King's impact. So you have that, right? But then you also have like how we remember King. And that's what the Ali Center, because I'm thinking like, oh, like when we remember King, hence when we kind of speak him back into current day, and we start thinking about his impact and his legacy and teaching him to the next generation so that they can live out his impact and live out his legacy. One of the things that we don't tend to think about is all of King. Like we remember King in bits and pieces, and we tend to remember him in the bits and pieces that are most comfortable for where we are as a society at a given time, right? And that's, so I think it's a great topic, and that to me is very frustrating because I've listened to people use King, his teachings, well, some of them, right, select the ones that fit his ideas to mute those who are being marginalized, right? And so something happens in a community, an improper trial verdict, someone is unjustly killed by local law enforcement or a random bystander citizen, and people protest. And then those who desire to silence them or at least mute them will then draw upon King and say, well, King would not have done it that way, right? King would have protested quietly. King would not have disrupted the community. King would not have ... King would not have done whatever it is that you're doing right now that I don't like. Right? And that's how we remember King, right? That's how we have been remembering King, within this kind of cultural or social epoch or time, whatever you want to use, right? Is we remember him in ways that fit whatever agenda it is that we have. And that's not remembering King, right? It's like, okay, well, what about all the ways in which he became a revolutionary?
Okay, so how do you think he should be remembered?
I mean, in his totality, like in his totality. But we don't But this is the thing, though, Mitch. Like, we don't remember. To remember King in his totality is to remember one, his humanity, right? His limitations, um, his growth and development over time. So he starts off as someone who's very much like, love, love thy neighbor, peace, so forth and so on. And then as he goes through his life, he does not lose that notion of love, but he also begins to expand his broader understanding. And he's like, you know what? I can love you, but I do also realize that nobody gives up power willingly. And if I love you, loving you is not simply asking you to do what's right, right? Loving you also entails me demanding of you to do what's right. And that's an active imposition, right? That's not just simply a passive request, but it's a demand. And it's a demand that I impose upon you, because when you love someone, that's what you do, right? You demand that they evolve. You push them to evolve. You don't allow them to sit back and do nothing, right? And so now what you have is conflict. And that's the King we don't talk about, right? Mm-hmm. You don't talk about the fact that he was a womanizer, right? Like, he was a human being. So, like, remember him as a human being. Because a couple things happen if you don't. If you remember him as just perfect, right? If he becomes a superhero, then people like me, people like you, your father, your sister, your mother, we can never become superheroes, right? Yes. And if that's how we remember King, if he's a superhero, then that we're off the hook for having to do what he did, right? We're not accountable. We're not held to that standard because we're not superheroes. So if you just remember him as a superhero, if you make him a demigod, what you do is you allow yourself to not have to follow those footsteps, because human beings can't be superheroes, right? Then you got on the flip side. If you reduce him only to the aspects that you find are palatable at any given point in time, right? Which is what America does with all of its people, right? Doesn't matter. Like, anybody who's done anything, we remember them in bits and pieces, in fragments. And I think, and when you do that, you rob them not only of their humanity, but you rob us of having to wrestle with our own. So how do you remember? You remember him in his totality, right? You remember that he is part of a larger discourse, that he was a being that evolved over time. He was flawed. And you also remember his revolutionary spirit as much as, right, where he started. Admire where he ended and where he began. Okay?
So do you think that his like teachings, philosophy should still be applied to current situations? Or
yeah. Well, I mean, because his teachings and philosophy are yes. The short answer is yes, right? But all of them need to be taught, right? Because they weren't his, right? Like, like, they weren't his, and they were based on a series of theological suppositions that predated him, right? And so in some very real ways, they're rooted in some truths, and truths predate all of us. And so, yeah, those things should be perpetuated down, right? Like, the idea of loving someone, like, that's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We confuse love with passivity. And this is what King even realized in his own life, right? C.S. Lewis says that love demands the suffering of the beloved, right? He also talks about being loved as being burdened, right? And loving as a burden, right? It's an action, and it's an action that if I love my nephew, right? Mm-hmm. I will not allow you to fall, right? Not permanently, right? Mm-hmm. I'll let you learn your own lessons. I'll let you fall off the bike. I'll let you hurt yourself. So, but what I won't allow you to do, I won't allow you to devolve. And I'll do whatever it takes, even against your will, right? To make sure that you have what you need, the challenges, whatever it may be, that you continue to evolve as a human being. And love does that. And love is not always passive. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's very violent, right? But you got to teach all of that.
And why do you believe he was the most important person to the civil rights movement?
And I don't know that he was, right? I think he was a very important person in the civil rights movement. But I think he was a piece, right? And that goes back to King would not have accomplished, if you look just at historical timelines in any event, King would not have accomplished what he accomplished if it had not been for the spirit and I don't want to relegate it to like Malcolm X, but like the spirit of Malcolm X, right? Like the more publicly abrasive and rebellious spirit, right? Of kind of the Malcolms in the world. Without that, King's not very successful. He's not successful at all. Right? Every major advancement that he was able to lead in this country only happened, right, after the display of rebellious violence articulated by the spirit of Malcolm, right? And those who hold that or held that. And so I don't know that he is a important person, but the important no. I think that's but again, I think that goes back to retelling the story of this civil rights movement. Right? We tell it like it's a story of King, and then the story of King that we then tell is a story of a loving, passive Black man who was willing to have violence inflicted upon him and never swing back.
So do you think that King himself is responsible for mainly his own success, or his like success in advancement is just a product of circumstance?
Product of circumstance. He was the right man in the right time. Now he had a particular skill set for sure, right? Without doubt, right? And so without that particular skill set, he could not have done what he did. But at the same time, without the particular circumstances in which he emerged with that skill set, he could not have done what he did. So it's not really either or. So yeah, so like he has certain skills, passions, worldviews, commitments that one situated him in that space and then made him someone who could potentially be very effective at being the face of a particular thing. But that particular thing in and of itself was bigger than him, right? But again, when we tell the story, Mace, we love to reduce it down to a loving, passive, almost docile Black man that if you assaulted him, he would not fight back. And that's a very convenient, very safe image to portray to a community or communities, right? Even beyond color, right? Seriously. Like if I tell you, listen, your greatest leaders were Black men who allowed themselves to be beaten, abused, fire hosed, dogs sucked on, and they never swung back. And they never swung back, Mace, because they believed that if they just kept loving their abuser would change. And there's no other social dynamic in which we produce that ideology as a valid or viable way of being in the world. You would never tell a woman who was in an abusive relationship with her husband, keep loving him and never swing back. And eventually he will come around. That's asinine. But you will tell Black men and Black women in the Black community, right? Because they, because of the space that King holds, that when they start to become angry, right? And rightfully so. If you see them starting to swing back, and rightfully so, well, you shouldn't swing back because the greatest of you, right? The greatest of you stayed in an abusive relationship with an abusive spouse and never swung back. So you should do the same. It's a very convenient story. That's all I'm saying.
And then the last question: do you think how he's being taught to people is like more detrimental to us as a society, the progress that he made when he was alive?
What was the last part of that?
So
The
do you
first
think
part blew
that
me away. Yeah.
how he's being taught and what we're being taught about him and his era and role in the civil rights movement is more detrimental to future progress than what he did in his time?
Who? That's a damn good question, Mace. Golly. Oh. Wow. More detrimental.
So like prevents future progress or
No,
can
no, no. And I'm
or
really I'm wrestling with that, man. You know what I mean? Like, because it's like, it's like I said, I was talking to the person with the Ali Center, and I was talking to my homeboy right now, like, whose basement I am currently in. He is he's the director for the Ali Center, and he and I were talking. He's like, he has some very real frustrations because he's like, he's born and bred. He was built. My friend was built in Louisville. Like Louisville built him, right?
Mhm.
And so part of that is Ali, right? And you don't get much more outspoken and you know what I mean, and
Mhm.
confident, and you know what I mean, than Ali, right? And he said, it frustrates him because I went to the museum yesterday. I was able to go through, me and like two of us. There was no one else in the museum. We could go through it by ourselves, right? With three people in the Ali Museum, which is like 3 or 4 stories. And so we just took our time and walked through it. And to be honest with you, Mace, I was probably like 5 minutes, about 10, 15 minutes into the museum, and I was emotionally tapped out. Right. I was done. Emotionally, intellectually, I was done because it was that overwhelming for me. And so I come back to the house, and I'm talking to my homeboy who now runs the Ali Institute. And I'm telling him about my experience. And he's like, yeah. But he's very frustrated. He's very frustrated because of, similar to King, the story that they're telling is not the full story of Ali, right? Um, they're picking and choosing those pieces of Ali that are not as threatening as Ali was as a full person, right? And and so that's one of his frustrations with the museum, and he's very passionate about that. But I'm over there sitting like, well, I just went to the museum, right? 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 And I'm floored. Like it, I receive things in that space that I will now take back with me to North Carolina when I leave out today, right? That have legitimately made, like legit, I mean this, like legitimately impacted how I will now move and show up in the world, right? That just happened to me last night, right? In like an hour. And so when you ask me this question about King, you know, does he do more damage? Does how we portray him, is it potentially doing more damage than the good that he did when he was here? Which I think is, I was about to cuss, I cuss, but is a phenomenal question. Um, that's tough, right? I don't know, because I think you can edit a story of a person. You can edit the story of a family. You can edit the stories of history. Like, you can do that. It's easy. You redact it. You take the names out. You take a particular dynamic out of the text, and it's no longer there. It's gone. You know what I mean? But you can't edit the spirit of something, right?
Mhm.
Like you can't control that, right? um, and oftentimes, even when we try to mute the spirit by editing the text, right, the spirit still shows up anyway. Um, uh, and does things that you were trying to prevent from happening. And then but in the same breath, right? Um, Sometimes the edited text for some becomes its own kind of like doctrine and spirit, right? So it's, I don't know. I don't know that if I don't know if how we remember him does more damage or good than he did when he was here. What I do know is that it does something, right? That was a really long answer with no definitive answer, right? To your question.
And then just the last thing, just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Um, we just got here talking, right? Um, so we want like the bio or just like name. What do you want?
Just anything that would relate to the topic or you, your
All
job,
right.
your occupation.
My name is Dr. Bryant. I am a professor, primarily trained as a critical social theorist and researcher at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. My background is in my undergraduate degrees are psychology and philosophy. My graduate degrees, my master's degrees are in psychology, philosophy, theology, and social work. PhD in social work and critical social theory. I spent a larger portion of my life as a social activist and community organizer. I also work prior to coming into academia. I worked in local politics around policy reform, specifically as it relates to criminal justice, healthcare systems, and educational institutions. I work with most of your major cities in the United States. I work with their criminal justice systems in one form or fashion or another, helping them to facilitate identify, assess, institutionalize more equitable practices within their professional spaces, right? So within the criminal justice system or healthcare system, whatever it may be. In my research area is race, institutional inequity, and Black and white body politics within the United States. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
I am the child of W.J. Bryant and Lenise Allen Bryant. There we go.
All right.
All right, my man. Good.
Thank you.
All right, young brother.
All right, shit.
Peace.